probably safe to say that no matter who we are or where we live, we are going to experience difficult times, right? There are things that's going to happen to us, unexpected, that we're not going to like. Some of us are going to experience sickness. Some of us are going to experience financial setbacks, loss of a job, loss of a relationship. Some of us are going to experience greater tragedies than that. Tragedies of war, death, natural disasters. Things are going to happen to us no matter who we are. So the question is not if bad things are going to happen. The question is, when are they going to happen and how do we respond, right? Let me say that again. It's not if, it's not whether or not they are. It's when they happen, how do you and I respond? My name is Michael Williams, and the title of this series is called The Joseph Factor. And Joseph was a character in the Christian Bible, in the Old Testament, in the Jewish Bible as well as in the Quran. So this is one of those characters that we all can relate to. And even if you're not religious, it doesn't matter. You can relate to this character as well. And the reason that I entitled this The Joseph Factor is because I believe that we can learn at least 7 lessons from the life of Joseph that will help us understand, that will help us see our life and see the things that happen to us from a different perspective. And that perspective is this, that you and I are always being repositioned for greater power, authority, and service. Now, someone might say, well, I don't care about power, I don't care about authority. Maybe I care about service, but I don't care about those other things. But I want you to follow me here. When I use the word power, I'm not talking about I've got power and I got power over you and I'm better than everybody else. I'm not talking about that kind of power. When I say power, I'm talking about the ability to make things happen, right? The ability to make things happen, the ability to make an impact in the lives of others. When I'm talking about authority, I'm talking about that something that you have within you to persuade, to move people to action, right? That just because of who you are, what you know, what you're capable of doing, you now have the ability to make things happen through your words, through your actions, through your thoughts, through your plans, through your persuasive speech. When I say persuasive, I mean that in a positive manner, right? So you have the authority to get things done. You have the ability to speak and make things happen, okay? And when I say service, I'm talking about the ability to provide something valuable to someone else. That is, something that you do, something that you say, could even be a part of who you are. Just being there adds tremendous value to the lives of others. So that when you pass through, right, when you pass through a place, an organization, a city, when you pass through this life, people can say that their lives were better as a result of you having been there. Does that make sense? Service. Power, authority, and service. That's what I mean. So let's back up a little bit. The Joseph Factor says that because of the things that's happening to you, you are constantly being repositioned for greater power, authority, and service. But it depends on how we respond. And so the first lesson in this entire series is what we're going to look at today. And that lesson is this. Bad things are going to happen to us. We're going to experience difficulties, trials, setbacks, adversity. But you and I are 100% responsible for how we respond. Let me say that again. No matter what happens to us, we're 100% responsible for how we respond. Let me say this a couple of different ways because it's very important. My response to everything that happens to me, now listen, determines everything else that happens to me. Let me say that again. My response to everything that happens to me directly determines, in fact, everything else that happens to me. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that no matter what happens to us, even if it's not our fault, and I'll give you an example, no matter what happens to us, even if it's not our fault, how we respond determines what happens to us next and what happens to us after that. Here's an example. Let's say you're in a car accident. It's not your fault, and this has happened to me. You're sitting there, you're literally sitting there, and someone runs into you. It's not your fault. You're not sitting where you're not supposed to be. You are where you're supposed to be. Someone runs into you. Well, your response to that event will determine what happens after. I mean, you could get out and you could get upset and get angry and end up in jail for just acting crazy, right? You could be upset. I mean, all kinds of things could happen to you if you don't respond correctly. Or you could say, hey, you can check to make sure that everyone's okay. You can call the police, and you can respond as calmly as possible because it wasn't your fault, right? Even though it may have put you in a bad situation, but it's how you respond that determines everything else that happens to you. That's just one example. There are many examples of things that can happen to you. You could be dismissed from a job, laid off. Well, some people decide they're going to go postal, right? And that obviously has its consequences, yes? Some people could see this as an opportunity to start a new career, right? Two totally different responses. But notice how their response, their individual responses, determined everything else that happened to them going forward. So one of the things that I want you to understand is that you're 100% responsible for your response, that is, for how you respond to everything that happens to you, even when it's not your fault. Now, we can see this in the life of Joseph. So what I want to do is just to give you some context, the background of Joseph, and we'll see at least 2 or 3 ways that Joseph understood that he was responsible going forward for everything that happened to him, and that he chose to respond in a certain way. And I'm going to show you 3 ways minimally that he responded. Okay, so let me just give you some background on Joseph. Now, Joseph was the son of Jacob, and Joseph was 17 at the time of this story, at the time of this kind of setting. And Joseph was Jacob's youngest son, but Jacob was very old when he had Joseph. So Jacob loved Joseph more than all of his other sons. He loved him more than all of his other sons. And to demonstrate this love, what Jacob did is he made Joseph this ornate robe, right? And many people say it was a robe of many colors, right? So he loved him, and he made this robe for him, or he had it made, and he gave it to him. Now, Joseph was put in charge of actually going out and checking up on his brothers. His brothers were out there herding the flocks and feeding the flocks and so forth. So Joseph would go out and kind of monitor them and make sure that they were doing what they were supposed to do. And at least on one occasion that it's recorded, Joseph came back and gave a bad report. And so the brothers didn't like that, right? The brothers didn't like that. Then Joseph had a couple of dreams, and I'm just going to read for you what these dreams were. It says, Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more, even more. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed to it. His brother said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told to his brother, he said, listen, he said, I had another dream. And this time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now, there's this next part, I want you to follow me because it kind of sets up the scene and lets us know of the kind of a situation that Joseph found himself in. And, you know, Joseph was probably a little arrogant, right? Telling his brothers a dream, maybe bragging about it, bragging about his little jacket and so forth. So you might be able to understand a little bit why his brothers were jealous of him or didn't like him. But I want you to check out this next scene because we're going to see how Joseph eventually responded. So let's just look at this kind of next thing that happened. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. And Israel, that was Jacob, said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." Because your brothers, they like to screw around sometime, right? I just added that in there. Then he sent them off to the Valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around the fields, because his brothers weren't there. He says, "What are you looking for?" He replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they're grazing their flocks?" "Well, they have moved on from here," the man answered. "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance. And before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. They were probably saying, "Man, here comes this little man. I tell you what, I can't stand this guy. Let's go ahead and let's kill him. Let's get rid of him," right? And take his coat, too. So they said, "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of the cisterns," right? It's like just a big, almost like a well. But fortunately, it wasn't filled with water. Just throw him into the cistern and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from his hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So he was going to sneak in and get him back. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe that he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it, luckily. And they sat down to eat their meal. They looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. So Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and lay our hands on him, and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite, interchange that with Ishmaelites, Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph out of the cistern. He was probably crying all night, or for however long he was there, and saying, Why are you doing this to me? Why'd you do this to me? I mean, he wasn't just sitting there calmly and patiently, more than likely. So they pulled him out, and they sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brother and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered the goat, dipped the robe in blood, and took the robe back to his father. And so then his father just totally fell out. He just was crying, and he mourned the loss of his youngest son and the one that he loved the most. Now, I'm going to skip forward, a couple of chapters, and here's where I want you to see how Joseph responded. Now, Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. And now watch this. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered and lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that Joseph gave him success, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household and entrusted his care everything he owned. So that is, Potiphar didn't have to do anything but just come home from work and think about what he had to eat. His entire household was being managed by Joseph, a slave. Now I want us to see a very powerful lesson here. One of the things that we know is that Joseph accepted responsibility for his actions going forward. Now, it wasn't necessarily his fault that his brothers hated him and threw him in the cistern. Now, he probably played a part in that, but certainly we can't make Joseph the blame for his brother's actions of throwing him in the cistern and then selling him off to slavery, right? So let's just say it wasn't his fault, but it happened, right? Total tragedy, right? It happened. So how did he respond? Well, I'm going to give you 3 responses that you and I can take and that we can learn from. 3. The first one is that, let me just make sure that we are on track. The first one is that he accepted what? Responsibility. Now, how do we know this? How do we know that he accepted responsibility? Well, if he hadn't accepted responsibility, then he might have been just there whining and crying and, well, why am I being sold into slavery? This wasn't my fault. It was my brother's fault. And I don't know why I'm here, and I'm just not going to do nothing, right? How do we know he didn't take that attitude? Because it says that the Lord was with him and gave him success in everything he did, and Potiphar put him in charge of his household. So we know, even if he did whine for a little while, he eventually said, okay, got to make the best of this. Got to do what I can do, right? Got to do the best that I can do. He accepted responsibility for how he responded to his circumstances going forward. The second thing he did is he acted, right? He took appropriate actions. What do I mean by that? It says that the Lord gave him success in everything he what? Did. That means he did something. What did he do? Well, he obviously did something that Potiphar liked. He did something that gave Potiphar success as well, tending his fields, managing different aspects of the household that made Potiphar happy, right? That was productive. So he obviously acted, he obviously did something that Potiphar admired, he liked, was effective, that was productive. So he didn't just sit back and go, I'm just going to do the bare minimum. I'm not supposed to be a slave. I should be here. So I'm just going to do something just to get by. No, he acted, but he took appropriate action that demonstrated that he had accepted responsibility. He took appropriate action that demonstrated that he was skilled, that he was knowledgeable, and that he was a hard worker. And we're going to talk about that in the next session, so I don't want to go too deep. But he took appropriate action. And in some cases, appropriate action may be getting away. It may be getting out of the situation. In other situations, you may not be able to get out of it, so you have to persevere. And that's this next one. He persevered. He persevered, right? Sometimes you find yourself in a situation and you just have to hang in there. You have to stick in there and you have to work hard. You don't just hang in there again and whine and cry. And we may go through those times and those periods where we do whine and we do cry and we do say why. But you got to get out of it as quickly as possible and persevere. Right? You have to hang in there. You got to persevere. You got to take appropriate action, whatever is appropriate for your situation. It may not mean you stay in that situation. If it's an abusive relationship, you may persevere just long enough to get out of it, right? So I'm not saying you got to hang in there and stay in there in every situation. It depends on your situation. But you hang in there, you take appropriate action, you accept responsibility for your response, right? So some things are simply not your fault. Some things we participate in. We do things that it's not just the other person's fault, but we also helped the situation along, right? So we have to take responsibility for the part that we've played as well. And then there's times where it really wasn't our fault. Accept responsibility. Now, what do all these things do? What they do is they help us become repositioned for greater success in life. Why? Because when you and I respond and when we take 100% responsibility for how we respond, then we're able to learn and to grow and to move forward, as we will see in the life of Joseph. And it took like 13 years for this process to take place. So in the next lesson, you and I are going to see a little more. We're going to look at the second lesson of the Joseph factor and how things happen to us, and depending on how we respond, it repositions us and kind of moves us forward so that we can impact the lives of others in a much greater way than what we would have if we didn't take responsibility, if we didn't respond, if we just whined and we cried and we said, this is not my fault, I'm only going to do the bare minimum, I can't stand working this job, I don't like living here, right? So, and this happens to all of us, right? So in the second lesson, we are going to look at the second thing, the second response that you and I can take that will help us be repositioned for greater what? Power, authority, and service. So I'll see you in the next lesson.